Welcome back everyone to a new video. Today we're going to be talking about obedience, Milgram's experiment. This is the first video in a series of 4 that will look at the entirety of the obedience subchapter within the social influence chapter. This is a little summary I made of the obedience subchapter that shows you all the connections between the different parts of this chapter. You can find the link to a PDF version of this in the video description below. The main gist of it is this: obedience can be explained with situational variables and dispositional variables. Situational variables include the Milgram experiment with all of its variations. There's obviously evaluation, the pros and cons of Milgram's experiment, as well as an alternative explanation, which is social identity theory. And further down, you find the situational explanations for why people behave the way they do in Milgram's experiment based on situational variables, which is the agentic state idea and the idea of legitimacy of authority. On the dispositional variables side, you've got Adorno's F scale, which he used to build the authority and personality scale and authority and personality period. And then some supporting and criticizing research studies to that. And also there, as an alternative explanation, we can bring in social identity theory. So let's start off with the bigger picture first and ask, what is the difference between conformity and obedience? Here's a quick comparison. So defining obedience is following orders coming from an authority without a question. So it is just, think of the military, a general telling soldiers what to do. That's a prime example here. Conformity, rather, is matching your attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors to group norms. So it's kind of like you're changing your behavior without anyone telling you to. So why do we do it? In conformity, we do it because we don't want to, we want to be approved by our social group, so we don't want to be disapproved. While obedience, we do it because we develop a fear, or in some cases respect, for authority. So there's a punishment element to obedience that we want to avoid. Status. Now, in obedience, you have this status idea that there's somebody who has a higher status than you giving you orders, while in the case of conformity, there is not necessarily a status difference. You can be on eye level and still you will conform to somebody else. So there's not that hierarchy thing. Let's look at our first experiment, which is Milgram's obedience study. So Stanley Milgram is the name of the experimenter, and he wanted to answer the question whether the Holocaust can happen again, or to what extent average human beings can be obedient. And as you might know from your history lessons, in the 1930s, the German state Let's look at Milgram's obedience study, which is the cornerstone of the obedience chapter. The experimenter name is Stanley Milgram, and he was interested in answering the question whether the Holocaust can happen again, or to what extent average human beings can be obedient. Now, blind obedience, as happened in the German Nazi state in the 1930s and 40s, meant that an entire nation followed a madman into a world war and killed 6 million Jews. So the question was like, how was it possible that millions and millions of people followed this idea and hardly anyone questioned this? How is that possible? And if you can understand it, maybe we can figure out if this can happen again, and if it can happen again, how we might be able to prevent it from happening. Right. So in the experiment he designed, he asked participants to give electric shocks to another participant under the orders of the researcher. So we're going to look at that setup in a minute. So the question here is, will participants administer deadly shocks just because the researcher told them to? Right? You see here the analogy to a dictator giving orders to soldiers or the wider population. The researcher here being the one giving the orders, the participant having to execute the orders that could potentially hurt somebody else. If you have time, I would highly recommend you watch this video. This is by Zimbardo. This is the guy who did the Stanford prison experiment. He's talking about Milgram's experiment, and he explains it quite well. So if you have time, go watch that. It will give you a much deeper understanding of what we're talking about. This is another video I want to talk about. Derren Brown, he's a magician, and he recreated the Milgram experiment in the 1910s, so just a few years ago. And I would highly recommend you watch this one as well. It's also really entertaining because the video footage is obviously very good, and you get all the reactions from him and the participants later on as well. Let's look in more detail at what these three individuals had to do. The experimenter, as we said, was giving the orders to the teacher, which was our participant. Now, what the teacher didn't know is that this individual right here is actually a Confederate, so an actor being paid to pretend to get electrocuted. And he wasn't actually electrocuted, he was just faking it, okay? So the learner task, I'm doing air quotes here, is to remember a pair of words. Obviously, they didn't have to remember the pair of words because they were just supposed to fake the electric shocks anyway. So the teacher, our participant, gives a pair of words, and the learner then has to remember what it is and repeat the pair of words correctly. Every time they give a wrong answer, the teacher will shock the learner. That's his task. And every time they does a new mistake, he will go up by 15 volts all the way to 450 volts, which is the maximum. Now, whenever this guy hesitates, the experimenter can use these 4 prods to encourage the tester to continue. And they increase in severity. Let's go through them. The easiest one is please continue or please go on. The next one is the experiment requires that you continue. It's a little bit harsher. The next one, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on. Should be a no. Okay. So you see the severity increases, where in this case, it's basically said you have no choice. You have to continue. Right. Okay. So these prods will become important later on. Let's look at the results. Let's first look into the yellow box here. So 100% of participants gave shocks up to 300 volts. Now, if you remember, 300 volts, which is somewhere here. No, that's not true. Can't read it, but it's already very strong. So it's labeled as quite high. Okay. So you can imagine already that participants must have felt quite uncomfortable giving this amount of electric shocks, but still 100% of them gave 300 volts. Then 12.5% of participants stopped right there and didn't want to continue even when these prods were read out. Okay, so participants stopped right there, 12.5% of them. But the thing is that, this is the crazy thing, 65% went all the way up to 450 volts, which was marked with a triple X. Okay, that's even after danger, severe shock. All right. Now, some other findings are that before the study, 14 psychology students were asked to predict what the outcome would be, how many would go all the way to 450 volts. And they said 3%, not more than 3% are going to go up to 450 volts, which is obviously, they were obviously massively off. And second of all, after the study, 84% of participants said they would actually quite happy and glad they participated, which is crazy because many of them might probably have thought that they seriously hurt another person, maybe even killed another person. So seeing that after being debriefed and learning about the fact that, you know, the person being shocked is actually a Confederate, an actor being paid to, and there was no shocks, 84% said, you know what, this was fine, which is a surprisingly high number in itself. All right. So what is the conclusion from all these results? Very shortly, we obey authority even if it causes harm to others. That is something to take home here right now. This experiment shows that normal human beings are capable of hurting other people when told to do so by a figure of authority. And that is massive. But let's dig a little bit deeper into the study. First, we got to ask, was this just a fluke? Did Milgram maybe not perform his experiment well? Were other experimenters able to replicate his findings? And in fact, a French TV show under the leadership of this French researcher whose name I will now butcher, Beauvoir, in 2012, did the same on TV. And in that experiment, 80% of participants gave the maximum, in this case 460 volts, to an apparently unconscious man. So the man apparently became unconscious in the experiment. They continued nevertheless. Now, if you compare that, that's even higher than our 65% in the original Milgram obedience study. So that is support suggesting that Milgram actually did his work quite well because other researchers have been able to replicate his work. There's another argument saying that maybe the participants knew the shocks were fake. So let's build an argument around that. Orn and Holland, 1968, argued that that's exactly what participants were doing. They were actually play acting. They kind of anticipated already that the shocks were not real, and therefore they just went all the way up because it just didn't matter anymore, right? That is a demand characteristic right there. And it's also low internal validity because the researcher is then really not measuring to what extent people will be obedient to a figure of authority. They're actually measuring to what extent, I suppose, they can figure out what the true purpose of the experiment is and then match their answers accordingly. Right? Now, another study by Perry, 2013, quite recently, if you consider the time frames we're looking at here, what she did, she went back to the Milgram's archive of tape recordings, right? So all of these experiments were recorded on tape. And she discovered that the experimenter often varied the prods, these 4 things that should encourage the participant to continue, like please continue and you must continue. These prods were actually not followed exactly. The experimenter was actually modifying it and therefore treating the participants differently all the time. And more importantly, this one's really the kicker, participants often said they were suspicious of the shocks, right? This links exactly to what Orn and Holland were suspecting with this whole play acting thing. That if you listen to the tapes, actually a lot of people said they didn't think maybe that the shocks were not real, but they definitely were suspicious of it being real, right? And that is a massive criticism. If participants really knew or anticipated that this thing was fake, then can we really trust this experiment in its entirety? Now there's a counterpoint to that. Sheridan and King, 1972. What they did is they recreated the Milgram experiment with puppies, and they gave participants the option to shock puppies that were sitting in a box with a wire mesh under their feet. So every time they press a button, the puppy would get an electric shock through their feet. Right? And the question was, would they give a real shock? The participants knew it's fatal. Now, just as a disclaimer, the puppies actually didn't die. They weren't actually electrocuted to death. And so that wasn't clear in the book, but I just read it up, and that's exactly, so the puppies were not hurt in this experiment. But it turns out that 45% of males and 100% of female participants actually gave those shocks to its maximum. Okay, so this study suggests that participants in Milgram's study were genuinely convinced that the shocks were real and not showing demand characteristics, right? Because this experiment worked as well, we can conclude that the Milgram experiment is not failing because of these demand characteristics, because people thought it was play acting, okay? Now, if you wanted to, you could make a completely different case as in terms of explanation for the Milgram experiment outcome. And that is social identity theory. Now let's remind ourselves what that is. The idea behind social identity theory is that you have a sense of yourself. Everything inside the circle is you, or what you think of yourself as. And then within that, you have a social identity, which is all the roles that you identify with. Like, for example, being a good father, or being a good daughter, or working, being a student. All your identities are within the circle. And if the aim of the experiment, which is helping science progress and so on, if you identify with the aims of the experiment, if that is within your social identity, right, then you can follow along quite easily with the demands of the researcher. But if the idea of following orders blindly, if that is something you generally oppose to, then you're going to have trouble with the demands of the researcher. And we can see that in the prods given. The first 3 prods do not require following blindly to orders. The 4th one does. Let's go back and check this out. So here are the 4 prods. This one, you have no other choice. You must go on. That is very much a you gotta obey kind of rule. The other three are more flexible and are aligned also with the aim of the experiment, right? Please continue, please go on. Just encouraging the experiment to go on. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue, right? This is all putting pressure on the participant by saying the outcome of the experiment depends on you, right? This is different from the fourth one, which says you have no other choice, you must go on. And that has very little to do with the experiment anymore, but it rather has way more to do with following orders blindly. And social identity theory, as proposed by Haslam et al. 2014, argues that the fourth prod is then outside of our social identity. And therefore, this is where the participants stop obeying. So that's it for today. If you'd like to download these slides, you can find them following the link in the video description below. If you are a teacher and you'd like to quiz your students on this content, you can sign up for free on ZenTeach and use our quizzing tool. Consider donating, following us on Twitter and YouTube, and definitely subscribe to get all the latest YouTube videos. The next lesson will be on obedience.